EJ, I just wanted to start with you. So the data in this report is clear that the decline in social trust and happiness in the US and Europe has led to a rise in political polarization and populism. Just wondering, just first, what was your reaction to the findings?
Well, first, let me say thank you to Gallup, and that's a thank you all the way back, because Gallup has asked good questions for decades and decades, and everybody who does any kind of research or citizens who want to understand politics is grateful to Gallup. And also, I got to mention the late Andy Kohut, who was the president of Gallup way back and is one of the great survey researchers ever, and also one of the great human beings in that community. So it's an honor to, and thank you to Semafor. I met Ben Smith when he was in his early 20s, and I knew this guy is going somewhere, and a pundit is always grateful when he or she is right, because often we're dead wrong, but I was right about Ben. Let me say I found this study very illuminating, very helpful, and I think there is, the finding on social trust and the difference it makes in voting for left parties or right parties is extremely important. And I think we were talking, Hilary and I were talking before, and she'll probably talk a bit more about this. If you looked at the recent German elections, who voted for Die Linke, the left-wing party, and who voted for the AfD, the far-right party, you really saw some of these factors at work. So I thought that was very helpful. But the second thing is, I think this paper is not a magic bullet, but it opens up new questions, because I think that one of the key questions here is what has reduced social trust? Why, in other words, trust itself is a real thing, and I think it's something we need to think about more. But why have people, particularly on the right, lost trust? What role has immigration itself played in creating more diverse societies? And have diverse societies, for some people, created greater feelings of mistrust? We have had a rather substantial change in the social values, dominant social values of the society. How much has that decreased trust? And the third point I'd make that I would underscore, if there's a critique of the paper I have, I do think it underplays still the role of economics. And its own data suggests that economics is really important, because happiness, the perceived happiness, is linked in part to economic position. And they note that GDP doesn't seem to have anything to do with happiness. And that's probably true, but GDP is about everyone, the whole society, and it doesn't speak to relative deprivation in the society, a great concept of British social scientist W.G. Runciman did great work on this many years ago. And the fact that societies have gotten richer and yet large parts of the society feel poorer or falling behind, I think does increase happiness. So I think what we need to do is take these really useful findings and link them to new questions. But I think it sets us on a good path.
And I'm glad you mentioned the role of economics, because I wanted to ask you, Hilary, just about that finding in the report that basically economic growth not necessarily is what's driving this, but a feeling of financial insecurity and loneliness that stems from what the report says is a damaged social fabric. This is particularly in communities, lower educated Americans, and rural areas and younger Americans as well. I'm just wondering how you think this sets up the scenario in which populism can thrive, and what you can make of those findings.
Right. Well, so the chapter that you gave us to look at looks at life dissatisfaction or life satisfaction as an indicator of happiness. And social trust sort of amplifies the differences between right and left responses to unhappiness. And typically you think that people who are economically insecure would swing left, but many of them move right. So there's these two kinds of populism are at work. We did a study with European data a few years ago, and I found that left-wing xenophobia, fear of immigrants and so on, it didn't necessarily have to do with how many immigrants there were in the country. It was more a sense of estrangement, right? feeling insecure, right? Not just financially, but also in terms of identity. Whereas on the left, xenophobia exists also on the left, fear of migrants, but the solutions were seen as more, that they should be more redistributive, right? The solutions would be a stronger welfare state and so on. In rural areas and in regions of Europe where there's been a long-term deindustrialization, that is coupled with out-migration. It's the loss of the next generation. And so these places are not only left behind, but the institutions in those communities that used to be supportive by a critical mass of people start to collapse too. So consider church attendance, right? Church attendance is difficult to do if you're in a rural area and there are very few people who go. Similarly, in small towns, to see small businesses and other institutions people were used to, those kinds of things disappear. Finally, what we do see is that class still matters, but it's class expressed as a divide between higher education and lower education, people who don't have college. And we see this in voting for populist parties, both in the United States, but also in most countries, even in the Nordic countries, we're seeing a division in attitudes and social trust based upon education level.
And Gerardo, you know, obviously the report focuses on the US and Western Europe, but based on your research, do you see any parallels to other places in the world? Are there other examples that we should be looking at in terms of similar scenarios playing out?
Thank you very much for the invitation and for encouraging this conversation. One thing that I want to mention is, I mean, Freedom House has been doing an analysis of political rights and civil liberties for. That's what Julius it's published.
No.
This is Julia Staley. You want to say something?
Hi. I'm just
There you go. Thank you.
putting this in.
Sorry about that. Again, thank you for the invitation. And what I was saying is Freedom House has been publishing a report on political rights and civil liberties since 1973. And this year, we just published a few weeks ago, and it is the 19th year of consecutive declines in civil liberties and rights in the world. Now, one interesting thing to connect to the happiness report is that of the top 25 countries in the happiness report, 23 in the Freedom House report happen to be free. So there is actually a correlation between rights, freedoms, and liberties and happiness. Finland, Costa Rica, Iceland are there, actually, and certainly it's an important element to convey. I think one thing that I would say in terms of just adding to the conversation on the chapter 7 on trust, I think it focuses mainly on institutions, I think, more than on interpersonal trust, which is important. And I think it does not distinguish that well, probably, elections that take place in free countries and elections that take place in non-free countries. Russia, Nicaragua, Venezuela, who are not free in our index, hold elections to legitimize their authoritarian power. And they're very different because oppositions cannot actually have the right to actually express their opinions. And so certainly that's a factor to consider. Elections were also in our report based on the analysis that we did on all of the elections that took place in 2024. In 40% of those elections, there was a way to disrupt the election in one way or another, whether it was assassination attempts for the candidates, all the way to harassment in the polls. And that was a diverse from countries that are considered free and countries that are considered actually not free or partially free. That's an element also to consider. And someone mentioned this morning, I think, in the first panel, the issue of peace and stability as part of the happiness. And certainly our report also adds to that in the context of saying that countries that are not peaceful certainly don't enjoy the same rights and liberties that countries that are actually in some sort of peace. And so that makes also a little bit of a difference, I would say.
And EJ, I want to go back to you about sort of the implications of this, particularly for the U.S. What does this mean for the political middle? The rise of populism, you see the U.S. dropping in the unhappiness score, people unhappy people gravitating toward the left and the right. I mean, is the middle just going to dissipate? What do you see sort of short and long term for our politics?
As Bill Clinton might say, it depends on what the meaning of the word middle is, in this context. I think what you are seeing, and I think the paper illustrates this well, is a decline of the center-right and center-left, and a kind of fragmentation. And again, this comes from a conversation Hilary and I had in the green room, where you see that in countries with multi-party systems, where you can actually see the whole spectrum of voting, you've seen a decline in both center-left and center-right parties. That's been particularly dramatic in Germany, where the Christian Democrats and Social Democrats have been forced into a coalition government. They were the two big parties getting 80-90% of the vote. Now they're barely managing half the vote. And you're seeing fragmentation to the left and the right of them. In the U.S., it's complicated because the Trump vote really is a combination of the far right, and Trump would probably be in another country a far right candidate. But the old Republican Party, large parts of that electorate, which might in some ideological sense be center right, has mostly fallen in line behind Trump. So we have this very odd situation, and his power in the party means that center-right is virtually silenced inside his party. On the Democratic side, as Democrats do, they're fighting each other on a lot of questions. That old Will Rogers line, I don't belong to an organized political party, I'm a Democrat. And so I think both the center-left and the left are kind of more visible, and that fight is easier for everyone to see. I think the Trump challenge, it will be interesting to see if the Trump challenge actually brings the center-left, the left and parts of the center back together again. The key to Joe Biden's victory in 2020 is that he rallied significant part of the center with the center-left and the left. Right now, the Democrats are torn up over this. I think the logic of the situation will likely bring those forces together, because otherwise they can't possibly challenge Trump effectively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and certainly we've seen that with the anger that Chuck Schumer provoked recently with his handling of the debt ceiling, which I thought of when I was reading this. The last thing I wanted to talk about, and this is sort of a question for all of you or any of you that wants to weigh in, just in terms of rebuilding social trust, what are the solutions here? What institutional reforms do you think could help address that in the United States?
Does that come to me?
Sure.
I'm happy.
You're going to solve the problem for us right here, right now.
I just want to say I'm happy to answer that. I think there are a few things. There have been strong, many initiatives in Europe, but also in the U.S. to try to encourage more social inclusion of those who are on the margins of the society. So there are a number of ways to go about it. One is a more general thing that could be for everyone, which is to improve access to public space and to make those spaces available to everyone. One of the things that's unspoken in all of this is how our cities have increasingly privatized public space out of this sense of insecurity. An attempt to create greater safety has also been an exclusionary process where people feel that they're under surveillance and so forth, right? So that we don't have a public square where everyone can assemble and meet across differences. If the opposite is that we're seeing public space being curtailed, right? So very few places to meet across social differences. And that's exacerbated by residential segregation, right? If rich people only live with rich people and poor people only live with poor people, then the institutions are also homogeneous in this way. So we don't build a good civil society where everybody can deal with differences and work towards common solutions. Moreover, just to build trust through things like, Labor Day parades, or well, I guess 4th of July parades, right? The institutions that used to bring an entire community together have fallen by the wayside, and part of it is segregation. So I would say we can strengthen the availability of public space and push against exclusionary privatization of spaces, and again, to try and develop local activities or found new nonprofits and associations in places where people across differences can meet on the basis of something that's constructive and productive, like a common goal of some kind, that doesn't have to do with politics.
Thank you all. We are actually out of time. This has been a wonderful discussion, and thank you so much.
Thank you.